It was supposed to be a simple evening, a quiet dinner, laughter, and a moment of peace after a long day. But in an instant, everything changed. The flashing red and blue lights, the blaring sirens, and the cold steel of handcuffs turned their world into a nightmare. Eleanor Jackson, a loving wife and soon-to-be mother, was thrown to the ground, her cries of protest swallowed by the deafening silence of injustice. Her husband, Ethan, could only watch in horror as the man who was meant to serve and protect shattered their reality. Officer Bradley Cole, with his piercing gaze and cruel smirk, had made his decision long before Eleanor even spoke. In his eyes, she was guilty, not of any crime, but of daring to exist in a world that refused to see her humanity. "Stop! She's pregnant!" Ethan's voice thundered through the air, desperation laced in every syllable. But his pleas met deaf ears. The crack of a baton against Eleanor's ribs sent a searing pain through her body, a pain that was not just physical, but a cruel reminder of the centuries of suffering her people had endured. As she lay there, clutching her stomach, the life growing inside her at risk, a bitter realization dawned upon her. Justice was not meant for people like her. And in that moment, a fire ignited in her soul. She would not let this brutality define her. She would not be another name lost in the shadows of injustice. The hospital room was sterile and cold, a stark contrast to the warmth that once filled Eleanor's life. Ethan sat beside her, his hands trembling as he held hers. The doctors had managed to stabilize her, but the damage had been done. Their child, their innocent unborn child, had paid the price for a system built on oppression. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face as she whispered, "Why? Why us?" Ethan had no answer. He had spent his life believing that if he worked hard, if he followed the rules, if he was a good man, his family would be safe. But now, staring into his wife's grief-stricken eyes, he realized the truth. No amount of goodness could shield them from a world determined to break them. But if the world refused to give them justice, they would take it themselves. Eleanor, despite her pain, straightened her back. "We fight," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of generations before her. "Not just for us, but for every family who has suffered like this." Ethan nodded, his jaw clenched with determination. The fight had begun, and this time they would not be silenced. The world outside moved on, oblivious to the storm raging inside Eleanor and Ethan Jackson's hearts. The police report was filled with lies, claims that Eleanor had resisted arrest, that she had posed a threat, that Officer Bradley Cole had merely acted in self-defense. The truth? It was buried beneath a system designed to protect those in power. Ethan clenched his fists as he stared at the report, his breath heavy with fury. "They are trying to erase what he did," he said, his voice barely controlled. "They want to paint you as the aggressor." Eleanor, still weak from the assault, met his gaze with unwavering strength. "Then we paint the truth. We make them see." But fighting for the truth meant stepping into a battle that had crushed many before them. They reached out to civil rights attorneys, activists, and anyone willing to listen. Some doors were slammed in their faces. Others offered empty promises. It was only when they met Jordan Reynolds, a passionate lawyer known for taking on police brutality cases, that hope began to flicker. Jordan leaned forward, his sharp eyes scanning the details of their case. "This isn't just about one rogue officer. This is about a system that allows people like him to operate without consequence. We won't just fight this. We'll expose them." His words sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be threats, attempts to discredit them, and moments where the weight of it all felt unbearable. But one glance at Eleanor, the fire in her eyes burning brighter than her pain, and he knew they had no choice but to fight. The media caught wind of their story, and soon, the Jacksons were no longer just another case. They became a symbol. Protesters flooded the streets, chanting Eleanor's name, demanding justice. No more silence. No more fear. The words echoed through the city, shaking the foundations of a system that had long thrived in the shadows. Officer Cole, once so confident in his power, now found himself under scrutiny. His past complaints, brushed aside by his superiors, were now being unearthed. Whispers of corruption within the department grew louder. The tide was turning. But with every step forward came resistance. Late one night, Ethan's phone rang. A deep, unfamiliar voice slithered through the receiver. "Drop this case, or you'll regret it." Ethan's grip tightened around the phone, his pulse pounding in his ears. Fear threatened to consume him, but he pushed it aside. He would not be intimidated. He turned to Eleanor, his resolve stronger than ever. "No matter what they do, we will not back down." She nodded, taking his hand in hers. "We started this fight together, and we'll finish it together." The battle for justice had begun, and the Jacksons were ready to face whatever came next. The courtroom was packed. The air crackled with tension as people murmured in hushed voices, their eyes darting between Eleanor Jackson and the man responsible for her suffering, Officer Bradley Cole. He sat stiffly at the defendant's table, his once smug expression now masked by cold indifference. Eleanor, her hands gripping the edges of the witness stand, inhaled sharply. This was it, the moment she had fought for, the moment she would finally speak her truth. Jordan Reynolds stood before her, his voice steady. "Mrs. Jackson, can you recount what happened on the night of the attack?" A heavy silence fell over the room. Eleanor's voice did not waver. "I was walking home. I had just finished grocery shopping when Officer Cole pulled up beside me. He stepped out of his car and demanded to see my ID. I asked why. I knew my rights." She swallowed hard, the memory crashing back like a tidal wave. "He didn't answer. He just grabbed my arm, tight, so tight it hurt. I told him I was pregnant, that he was hurting me, but he didn't care. He slammed me against his car, twisted my arm, and threw me to the ground." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Eleanor turned her gaze toward the jury, her voice filled with quiet determination. "I screamed. I begged him to stop, but he kept going. And when I finally blacked out from the pain, I remember thinking, he didn't see me as a person. Just another black woman he could brutalize without consequence." Tears welled in Ethan's eyes as he watched his wife relive her trauma. His fists clenched, his nails digging into his palms. This wasn't just about justice. It was about making sure no one else endured what she had suffered. The prosecution presented damning evidence, security footage, medical reports, a pattern of complaints against Cole that had been ignored for years. The defense scrambled to discredit Eleanor, but their arguments were weak against the mountain of truth. Then came the moment that sent a chill through the entire courtroom. Jordan Reynolds, with a knowing smirk, approached the defendant's table. He slid a thick file across the desk. "Officer Cole," he said, his voice smooth and deliberate, "do you recognize these documents?" Cole hesitated. I don't know what you're talking about." Jordan's smirk deepened. "Funny, because these are internal police records. Records that prove not only your misconduct, but the department's efforts to cover it up." A shocked murmur filled the courtroom. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. This was bigger than Cole. This was about the entire system. The judge slammed his gavel. Order in the court. But the damage had been done. The truth was out. For the first time, Cole's mask cracked. He shifted in his seat, sweat forming at his brow. He knew this was no longer just about him. The trial stretched for weeks, but with each passing day, it became clearer. The Jacksons were winning. The case had ignited something far greater than a single conviction. People took to the streets, demanding accountability, demanding change. And as the jury was dismissed to deliberate, Eleanor and Ethan held hands, their hearts pounding in unison. Justice was within reach. The courtroom was silent, yet the tension was suffocating. The jury had returned, their faces unreadable. Ethan gripped Eleanor's hand so tightly that his knuckles turned white. This was the moment they had been fighting for. The judge, an older man with a firm expression, cleared his throat. As the jury reached a verdict, a juror, a middle-aged black woman with a resolute gaze, stood. She looked directly at Eleanor before speaking. "We have, Your Honor." Eleanor's heart pounded. Every second felt like an eternity. "In the case of the state versus Bradley Cole, on the charge of aggravated assault, we find the defendant." She paused, letting the weight of the words settle over the room. "Guilty." A collective gasp filled the courtroom, followed by an eruption of whispers. Ethan exhaled sharply, his grip on Eleanor tightening. She covered her mouth with both hands, overwhelmed by emotion. The words echoed in her mind. Asterisk guilty. He is guilty, asterisk. The judge banged his gavel. Order in the court. Officer Bradley Cole remained motionless, his face pale. For the first time, there was no arrogance, no smug smirk, only the realization that his power had crumbled. The weight of justice had finally caught up to him. The judge's voice rang clear. Bradley Cole, you have been found guilty of aggravated assault. Given the severity of your crime and your history of misconduct, I hereby sentence you to 20 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. The moment the sentence was announced, the courtroom erupted. Some gasped, some cheered, some cried. Reporters bolted for the doors to break the news. Community members who had stood by the Jacksons hugged one another, celebrating this rare moment of accountability. Eleanor closed her eyes as relief crashed over her like a wave. It was not just a victory for her, but for every person who had ever suffered injustice in silence. Ethan wrapped his arms around her, his voice shaking. We did it, Eleanor. We really did it. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Justice, she whispered. Real justice. Outside the courthouse, a sea of people awaited the verdict. The moment Eleanor and Ethan stepped through the doors, the crowd erupted in cheers. Signs waved in the air. Asterisk, no more silence, asterisk. Justice for all. End police brutality. A woman rushed forward, tears in her eyes. Mrs. Jackson, thank you. You fought for all of us. Another man, holding his young son, nodded at Ethan. Your family's strength gave us hope. Eleanor, despite the exhaustion weighing on her, stood tall. She had spent so long fighting for this moment. She would not let it slip by without speaking her truth. She turned to the crowd, her voice strong and unwavering. This victory isn't just mine. It belongs to every mother, every father, every child who has suffered injustice but never lost hope. We have proven that no one, no matter how powerful, can escape accountability. A roar of applause swept through the crowd. Ethan held her hand, pride shining in his eyes. This battle was won, but their fight was far from over. As they walked away from the courthouse, hand in hand, the weight of the moment settled in. Justice had been served, but change, real change, was still a long road ahead, and they were ready to walk it. The battle in the courtroom had been won, but for Eleanor and Ethan, justice was not just about a single verdict. It was about ensuring that no other family would have to endure the same nightmare. As they left the courthouse, reporters swarmed them, shoving microphones forward. Cameras flashed, capturing the raw emotion on their faces. Mrs. Jackson, what does this verdict mean for you? One journalist asked. Eleanor took a steady breath. This is bigger than us. This is about every black family that has been forced to suffer in silence. We are done suffering. We are done being ignored. Ethan placed a protective hand on her back. The fire in her voice, the unwavering strength in her eyes. This was the woman he fell in love with. And today, the world was finally listening. Despite their victory, a shadow of loss still loomed over them. The scars, both seen and unseen, would take time to heal. But Ethan knew one thing for sure. His wife was a warrior. That night, in the quiet of their home, Ethan found Eleanor sitting by the window, lost in thought. The moon cast a soft glow over her face. He walked over, kneeling beside her. What is on your mind? He asked gently. Eleanor turned to him, her eyes glistening. I do not just want to win in the courtroom, Ethan. I want to make sure no one else has to fight this battle alone. A slow smile spread across his lips. Then we turn this pain into purpose. She searched his eyes. Are you ready for that? He took her hands, pressing them against his heart. I will fight for you, Eleanor, and for every family like ours. From that moment, the fight was no longer just about justice. It became a mission, a promise, a movement. The next day, the community gathered in celebration. People flooded the streets, holding banners and chanting their names. The city had witnessed a victory, but more than that, it had seen a shift, proof that power did not always win, that voices raised together could shake the very foundation of injustice. At the center of it all, Eleanor stood tall. She raised her hands for silence, and the crowd stilled. This is not just my fight, she said, her voice carrying over the people. This is for every person who has been told that justice does not belong to them. We have proven that it does. The crowd erupted in cheers, voices lifting together in unison. Ethan squeezed her hand. "Look at them. You have given them something they have not had in a long time." She turned to him. "Hope." The sun dipped below the skyline, casting the city in golden light. As the chants of the crowd echoed through the streets, Eleanor knew this was only the beginning. The fight was far from over. Though the courtroom battle had ended, Eleanor and Ethan knew their fight for justice was far from over. Victory in one case did not dismantle an entire system. It was only the first crack in the walls of oppression that had stood for generations. Despite their grief, the Jackson family found solace in knowing that Officer Bradley Cole had been held accountable. His conviction sent a powerful message. No badge could shield a man from justice forever. As news of the trial spread, the community rallied behind them. People who had once felt powerless now stood with renewed strength. They were no longer just bystanders. They were part of something bigger, a movement demanding real change. A few weeks later, Eleanor and Ethan sat together in their small living room, the weight of their experiences settling in. Ethan reached for her hand, his grip firm yet gentle. "We have been through so much," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "But we are still here." Eleanor looked at him, a new fire in her eyes. "We have to do more, Ethan. We cannot let this end here." A silence stretched between them, not of uncertainty, but of understanding. Ethan nodded. "Then we take everything we have been through and make sure no one else suffers the way we did." It was then that an idea was born, one that would turn their pain into a force for change. Months passed, and Eleanor's strength slowly returned, though the emotional wounds remained. Through the darkest nights, Ethan remained by her side, his love unwavering. Then, on a quiet morning bathed in golden sunlight, their lives changed once more. Inside a small hospital room, Eleanor lay in bed, her face glowing with exhaustion and joy. In her arms, she cradled a tiny, crying newborn, her son. Tears welled in Ethan's eyes as he gazed at them, overcome with emotion. Carefully, he reached out and took the baby into his arms, holding him close to his chest. "We will name him Justice," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "because he represents everything we have fought for." Eleanor smiled, her fingers brushing against the baby's delicate hand. "Justice," she repeated softly. "We will make this world better for you." Their son's first cries filled the air, a symbol of new beginnings, of resilience, of hope. But for the Jackson family, this was not just a personal moment of joy. It was the start of something far greater. 1 year later, that vision took form. Using the settlement money they had received from the city, they founded the Jackson Center for Justice and Equality, a place where victims of police brutality could find support, where legal aid and advocacy would be available to those who needed it most. On the day of the grand opening, people from all over the city gathered to witness history being made. Eleanor stood at the podium, baby Justice in her arms, Ethan beside her. She looked out at the crowd, at the faces filled with hope, and took a deep breath. "We have endured pain," she began, her voice steady and strong. "But we refuse to let it define us. This center is more than just a building. It is a promise. A promise that no one will have to stand alone in the fight for justice." The crowd erupted into thunderous applause, some wiping tears from their eyes. Small children waved banners that read "Justice for All," while elders nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of this moment. But while the Jacksons and their community celebrated, elsewhere, another moment was unfolding, one of reckoning. Inside a cold, gray prison cell, Officer Bradley Cole sat alone, staring at a small television screen. The news played footage of the Jackson Center's grand opening, of the people chanting Eleanor and Ethan's names. His once arrogant face was now hollow, devoid of the pride he had carried for so long. Under relentless legal pressure, Cole had been forced to confess, and his confession had shattered more than just his own career. It had exposed an entire system of corruption within the New Orleans Police Department. In a recorded statement, his voice had been eerily empty. "I was just a small part of a much bigger game," he had admitted. His words had sent shockwaves through the city, igniting an investigation that threatened to bring down the entire corrupt power structure that had long operated in the shadows. Now, as he sat behind bars, Watching the Jacksons turn their pain into purpose, regret flickered in his eyes. But it was too late. The future he once envisioned was gone, replaced by the cold, unchanging walls of his prison cell. Back at the ceremony, Eleanor and Ethan stood together, their hands intertwined. As they cut the bright red ribbon, marking the official opening of the center, the crowd erupted once more. Eleanor looked down at her son, now peacefully asleep in her arms. "You are our hope," she whispered, "and we will do everything in our power to make this world better for you." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze filled with unwavering determination. They had endured a nightmare that once seemed impossible to escape, but they had survived. They had fought, and now they were leading a movement that could not be silenced. The Jackson Center for Justice and Equality was more than just an organization. It was a beacon, a symbol that even in the darkest moments, hope and resilience could light the way forward. Their story was no longer just about justice. It was a testament to the power of love, perseverance, and the unbreakable will to fight for what is right. And as the city watched, as communities rallied, as the truth continued to unravel, one question remained. Would this be enough to dismantle the system? Or was the real battle only just beginning? Hashtag, 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 what would you do if you were in Ethan's position? Would you have the strength to stand against an entire system for the ones you love? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your voice. This is not just the Jackson story. It is a reminder that justice must be fought for and protected. Share this video, spread the message, and be part of the conversation. Do not forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that demand to be heard.